got to the point where he could read a Gemara and he could punctuate it. And he could tell you, this is a question, this is an answer. He said, but when they asked me what's wrong with the Gemara, I have a clue. I know what to say. This is a question, this is an answer. That's all. To think independently, to ask yourself whether it makes sense or not. And I think that typically in today's university education, that's it's not stressed, it's not valued, it's not rewarded. Just learn what the professor says and learn how he wants to spit it back the way he says it. Challenge him, challenge his reasoning or his conclusions. They're not interested.
I mean, it's not like I don't have questions, but I'm very involved in the cigarette. I can't say I have any major questions that are having in Judaism. I constantly have in my mind.
Yeah. Okay. What sukkah are you learning?
I'm learning Makos right now.
Oh, Marcus, boy. A lot of very difficult and controversial stuff over there.
I actually do have a question. So we have all this idea that we never kill anybody. We try our hardest not to kill anybody.
We never kill anybody. It's certainly too strong. We try our hardest. You mean to say in the courtroom procedures, we put a great emphasis on saving the defendant from being judged to suffer the death penalty. Right. Yeah, okay.
So much that in the last paragraph in the first paragraph of Marcus in the last mission, it says that there was Lashon Good in the Tosfos, that we would never kill anybody.
Well, obviously, that's meant as a Lashon Guzma. It means that we would want to make sure that the penalty was deserved. Yeah.
So we go into great lengths, but how does that work? It seems almost too loophole-y to say this guy, he probably did, but since we don't have 100% proof, or we can't, we don't have 100, or we don't have a lot of proof, then we can't kill him.
Okay, you're asking the question that you're asking. I don't think you can possibly appreciate how deep that question goes. Why is there such a great resistance to pronouncing a person subject to the death penalty? Questions like that, before you attack the question, you have to step back and ask yourself, within what framework am I asking this question? Am I asking the question within the framework of intuitive justice? Which you can ask. Even from a Jewish point of view, you can ask it. But is that the framework? So then the question will be, what's the relative value, on the one hand, of human life, and on the other hand, the value of executing guilty criminals? And playing one off against the other might give you a scale on which to judge how serious the efforts ought to be. You have to look at executing a guilty criminal as also a moral loss. So the question is, which moral loss is greater and how you play with the details under those conditions. That's one framework. There's another framework, which is, this is a divinely instituted law, and it goes hand in hand with divine providence. That's an entirely different matter. That means if you apply the law the way the Torah defines it, that's going to play hand in hand into the way in which divine providence determines, were there witnesses there or not? And did the witnesses get tripped up under cross-examination, or didn't they get tripped under cross-examination? And were the witnesses perhaps relatives who are disqualified from testifying, and therefore there's no way to convict? I'll give you a couple of very simple laws which nudge you in the direction of thinking that the right context is the context of divine providence. If the court is unanimous that he's guilty, then he's not executed. What? So, if you put it in the wrong context, well, if it's unanimous, then there must be some lack of objectivity there. There's always enough room to play with evidence that somebody should look at it differently. But that's not very convincing. Some cases are really open and shut. Some cases you have very, very massive convincing evidence. Would you think that 23 people discussing whether the Holocaust is a real historical event or not, and you shouldn't trust them if they're unanimous? I think you would expect unanimity, of course. And you wouldn't say that if they're all unanimous, then somebody must be prejudiced. This evidence is overwhelming. Couldn't there be evidence like that? So then, once you put it into the context of divine providence, what you're being told is, God doesn't want this person to be punished. Sure, he's guilty. Sure, he's guilty. But God doesn't want him to be punished. If God wanted him to be punished, then God would have gerrymandered the available evidence so that it would have some ambiguity in it, and it wouldn't be 23-0. Similarly, Rabbi Meisman points out in his book, disqualifications for testimony. Peter kills Paul in broad daylight in the street, and there are 24 witnesses. They all come flocking to Bezdin. And the Bezdin interviews them and takes their testimony and starts the adjudication. And then it turns out that one of the witnesses is Paul's brother. Oh, that's not good. Paul's brother is disqualified. It's a witness. He can't give testimony. Good, so you throw Paul's brothers out. Guess what? You throw out the other 23 also. Why? They all came together as a mass to Bezdin. So what? So what? The fact that Paul's brother is there discounts the testimony of 23 non-relatives? It's a rule. We don't allow that testimony. Another example. 2 people witness a murder. They both see it simultaneously with their eyes. You question them, what they saw, the time, the conditions, what they were wearing, the weather, and their testimony is within acceptable limits, unanimous. Then one of the judges asked, by the way, how were you situated when you saw this murder taking place? You were both looking at the street, and Peter killed Paul in the street, but where were you? Well, we were in an adjacent field. Describe to us the layout of that field. Well, it was a field of dirt. There was nothing growing there. And there was a fence running down the middle of the field. Oh. And where were the 2 of you situated vis-a-vis the fence? Well, one of us was on this side of the fence, and one of us was on that side of the fence. And was the fence transparent? No, it was a fence, picket fence, opaque. Then we don't prosecute. Why not? Because the witnesses couldn't see each other. They couldn't see each other. That's called edus miyucheres. They can't see each other, we don't convict. Why not? They weren't supposed to be looking at each other. They're supposed to be looking at the murder. In fact, they were looking at the murder. Why is the fact that they can't see each other a reason that you can't convict? In Jewish testimony, you can't convict. So if you're talking about justice, that's just weird. It's weird. It has absolutely no reason for it whatsoever. By the way, disqualification of relatives, though you could think up psychological explanations, the Rambam, for one, rejects them. The Rambam says we do not disqualify a witness on the grounds that he loves the victim or that he hates the accused. We don't take emotions into account. We assume that when it comes to testimony in a trial, the person is going to testify fairly and as accurately as he can. Why should I disqualify a witness? Because Maimonides, it's a pure Gzeras Melech, a decree of the king. Even Moses wouldn't be able to testify against Aaron, and vice versa. So there again, so now if you're thinking in terms of prosecuting justice, these things make very little sense. If you think that the laws of the Torah, civil laws and criminal laws, are supposed to be connected to divine providence, so then if God wants the criminal punished, he'll arrange that his cousin or his brother won't be there. He'll have a fainting spell 2 blocks away, or he'll get a cell phone call, it'll have to be 2 blocks away, and he won't be there. God can run the world and arrange that. If it's arranged that his brother is there, it means God doesn't want this person punished for whatever reason. Now, Yorlani Makos, the same logic is applied. Maharal talks about it. Doesn't say it exactly in these terms, but I think that it's basically the same idea. The rule of Eidim Zomim. Eidim Zomim means 2 people give testimony they saw a crime. 2 later witnesses say that the first 2 witnesses weren't present at the time and place of the crime. They were someplace else. Since they were someplace else, they could not have given accurate testimony. The later witnesses don't dispute whether the event took place or not. They weren't there either, so they don't know if it took place yet. But they say, when you say you saw it, you're lying because you were with us someplace else. Good. The Torah tells us to treat the first two witnesses as guilty of lying in court and to pay a penalty. I'm marking my words now. I said treat them as guilty. For those you know the sugis, you know a little bit what I'm referring to. Fine. Treat them as guilty. What happens? What happens is they have applied to them whatever punishment would have been applied to the person they were testifying against. But that's only under certain assumptions. The particular assumption is that this secondary testimony accusing them of lying in this way is after the court has pronounced judgment on the original defendant and before the judgment has already been carried out. If the judgment has already been carried out, then the lying witnesses do not get punished. Now again, in terms of human justice, that's absolutely that's worse than weird. If you're going to punish them for trying to institute an unjust punishment, certainly when they succeed in instituting an unjust punishment, they should be punished. But no, Torah says no. So if you're talking in terms of intuitive human justice, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But if you understand that when the secondary witnesses come to court, when they get there, a month earlier, a month later, is subject to divine providence, then the fact that they come later means that God doesn't want them punished. Doesn't want them punished. Otherwise, God could have arranged it that those witnesses would come earlier, and then they would be punished. But if you see it in terms of an application of law in the context of divine providence, then all these questions go away. There's a Ran, Drashas Haran, which a friend of mine pointed out to me, where he says, the laws of the Torah, civil and criminal laws, are not meant to be just. They're not meant to be just. They're not designed to be just. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to work together with divine providence. Justice is when the king exercises his prerogative to do things at his will. Move property around, move people around, have taxes for the people, and so forth and so on. Kill someone who is disloyal to him. That's where laws of intuitive justice can be applied. But the laws of the Torah aren't designed for that. One other qualification, which I'm going to mention, this is a gigantic subject. When you talk about civil law, laws of contracts and laws of agreements and laws of taking possession, and some of them are very peculiar, some of them are very hard to understand in terms of our intuitive ideas of justice, rectitude. You have to keep in mind that civil law, monetary law, all the laws that are on the statute books are only default. They're only default. You can write an agreement any way you want. You can set up any conditions in the agreement that you want. Only adult men can be witnesses. You can write into the agreement, if an adult woman says XYZ, then the agreement is void. And then it'll be void. You want to make women equal to men as far as this agreement is concerned? You can do that. We have a general rule of law that if A is claiming money from B, A has to prove that he's right. You can write into this agreement that A is the one who's holding the money, but if there's a disagreement about where the money should go, then A has to prove it, and not B. You can write agreements any way you want. So if you want to make the agreement more in line with what you think intuitively is fair and appropriate, you can always do that. The laws on the books are not binding. They're just default in absence of an explicit agreement. At any rate, that is where you put it into the context of divine providence. Many of these questions go away. On the other hand, there are times when you look carefully at the law and you can see that the law does agree with some of our intuitive judgments. Here's one that uneducated people come across a one-liner and it's very disturbing to them. And if you study the law carefully, you can see that it's not nearly as disturbing as it appears. Ruvain is a smoker, reasonably heavy smoker. Okay, he knows on Shabbos you're not supposed to smoke, but Shabbos in July, and the afternoon is long, and it's hot, and he really wants to smoke. Now, the external critic says, are you really going to tell me that because he loses the battle with his evil inclination and he lights up a cigarette, he's going to die? He's going to die for lighting up a cigarette on Saturday afternoon? Isn't that a little extreme? I mean, shouldn't there be some correlation between the size of the crime and the size of the punishment? He didn't commit murder after all. Didn't worship an idol. He gave in to a desire to light up a cigarette. Why should he die for that? Now, taking the first attitude that I've been describing the last 10 minutes, you could say, Shabbos is ordained by God, and God knows how serious it is, and he's telling you that you have to die for it. You could say that. And there's nothing wrong with that answer. There's nothing wrong with that answer. But let's fill in a little bit of the legal facts. Let's take the scenario, the way the critic envisions it. You know, Reuven's there, and he's dying for a cigarette, and cigarettes are on the shelf, and meanwhile, Shimon and Levi are spying through the window, unbeknownst to poor Reuven. And Reuven loses the battle, he takes the cigarette, it lights up, and Shimon and Levi run off to the police. The police come and line him up and say, okay, you're out. You smoked on Saturday, you're dying. That's not the law. That's not the law. In order to be prosecuted for capital punishment, there has to be a warning. The warning has to be issued immediately before the action. The warning has to say you're being watched by witnesses, and if you do this, you're going to die. And he has to respond. He has to say, yes, I know, and I'm doing it anyway. If those conditions aren't met, the law does not require that he should be killed. Now let's ask a question. Let's go back to Reuven. It's 5:15 on Shabbos afternoon. He's been 20 hours without a cigarette, and he's dying for a cigarette, and he reaches for the pack. Shimon and Levi aren't spying secretly from the window. Shimon and Levi walk in, and they say to him, Reuven, it's Shabbos afternoon. If you light up that cigarette, you're going to die. If he wants a cigarette, if that's what he wants, what is he going to do? He's going to say, "Oh, thank you, Shimon and Levi. You saved my life. I forgot that it was Shabbos. I'm daydreaming. I'm thinking about my next week's business deals. Thank you." Put it back on the shelf and says to them, "Goodbye. Have a nice day." And when they leave, he shuts the door, pulls down the blind, and lights up his cigarette. What would lead Reuven to say to Shimon and Levi, I know you're watching, and I know it's a capital crime, and look, in your face, I'm doing it anyway. What would lead him to do that? Not a desire for a cigarette. Not a desire for a cigarette. The only thing that would lead him to do that is the desire to make a public anti-Shabbos demonstration. That's what you die for. You don't die for smoking the cigarette. You die for making a public anti-Shabbos demonstration. That's a horse of another color altogether.
You can say that by cigarettes, but not by murder.
Yes, it works by murder also.
Would someone be willing to die to kill someone else?
He doesn't know he's going to die. First of all, there are people who are like that. They're definitely willing to die, and as long as they get the other guy, right? They want him to die. Suicide bombers, right? They die when they kill people. I know people who go into things where they know they can die. That's number one. And number two, will I die? Will I get off? Will I hire a fancy lawyer? You know, it's not the same as having it in front of you. At any rate, that is the rule. There's only one exception. And the exception is where someone tries to induce other people to worship an idol. May seem some idea. There, you can hide witnesses, and they can spy on him without any warning, and then you can punish him. And Edim Solomon is the case which Gemara discusses as to whether that's Asra or isn't that Asra. And that was a whole long, complicated thing. But in general, but when the critic says, "What? You die for violating Shabbos?" The answer is that's not true. You don't die for violating Shabbos. You die for purposely making a public anti-Shabbos demonstration. That's a different matter altogether. The critic may not like that either, but it's not what he asked about. It's not that was bothering him in the first place. So sometimes when you analyze the law in detail, you get a much better picture of what's going on, and it can help with the intuitive judgment of justice. But when it doesn't help, if you put it into the context of divine providence, which the Talmud and other sources do quite often, then all of a sudden all bets are off because there are hidden conditions that we don't know about. Here's another example. This is a question that's raised in modern philosophy, something which some people call moral luck. I'm giving a very simplified example of it. Bernard Williams used the example of Paul Gauguin, the French painter. A decides that he's going to kill B. And he gets a gun, tracks B down, gets him in the sights, pulls the trigger, and the bullet flies true, and B dies. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two, A decides that he's going to kill B, tracks B down, gets B in the sights of the gun, pulls the trigger, and a sudden gust of wind blows the bullet aside. And B does not die. One is murder and one is attempted murder. Now, how do we feel about those two crimes? Are they equal? Does A deserve the same treatment in both cases? How should we deal with it? In modern philosophy, this is a big problem because we seem to have intuitions going in both directions. And that means we're sort of ambivalent. We're suffering an inner contradiction. On the one hand, there's a natural intuition. Nobody died. In the second case, nobody died. Didn't kill anybody. Okay, what he did is nasty. It shows he has bad character. There should be some punishment or other, but it's not as drastic as killing somebody. On the other hand, the difference between the two cases is a gust of wind, something over which A had no control whatsoever. Why should that have any effect whatsoever on how A should be evaluated and how A should be treated? When you look at the moral irrelevance of the gust of wind, the natural feeling is attempted murder should be treated exactly the same way murder is treated. On the other hand, something about that sounds funny. It sounds peculiar. And there isn't, as far as I know, any satisfactory resolution of this problem in modern philosophy. It's a difficult problem. There are a number of problems. Oh, maybe I'll tell you another one that's in modern philosophy as well. Now, in our context, this problem doesn't arise. Mark my words. I don't say we have a solution for the problem. I say the problem doesn't arise. There's a big difference between the two. We don't solve the philosophical problem. We just have a context in which the problem can't be stated. It can't be considered. Because we would say the reason why you treat successful murder more severely than attempted murder is because the gust of wind wasn't an accident. The gust of wind was God's way of saying, I don't want the second guy executed. I only want the first guy executed. So God is sending a signal. This is what I want to happen to this guy. So the divine providence operates in the context of that law and determines the outcome that God wants. So if we're asked, why do you treat them differently? It's only a gust of wind. We say because from our point of view, the gust of wind isn't an irrelevancy. It isn't just an accident. It's a signal from the Creator that this is the way I want it to be treated. So then everything's finished. No problem. Similar example, which certain very sensitive philosophers like Thomas Nagel have raised and discussed on occasion, others as well, Bernard Williams as well. Let's suppose you could save a person's life for $15. The person is dying and he needs, $15 to save his life. It's right in front of you. Right? Would you spend $15 to save somebody's life? Almost everyone will say yes. Of course, $15. Well, there are people in places in the world who are starving, who don't have adequate clean water supply who are subject to diseases that are spreading. And let's suppose that $15 will save one of those people's lives. Okay, but then $30 will save 2 lives. $45 will save 3 lives. $60 will save 4 lives. Now here's the question. Is it morally permissible for you to go out to dinner in a restaurant? Out to dinner in a restaurant. You're going to spend $15 on food, which probably isn't good for you, not good for your health, to avoid the difficulty of making dinner at home. So it's 20 versus 5. The difficulty of making dinner at home is so odious to you, so tedious to you, that it's not worth someone else's life. So how do you ever spend any of your money on anything than absolute necessities? Sensitive philosophers worry about this. And they say it's very difficult to explain a reasoned motivation to do that. Jewish law has certain parameters for charity. If the person who's needy isn't in front of you, the demand for charity isn't there. And even if he is in front of you, although it's rabbinic, it is binding. For us, the rabbis are agents of divine providence. You don't give away more than 20%. 20% roughly works like this. When you first come into your money, like your inherit money, so then you give away 20% of the money, and from then on, it's 20% of the profits you earn. That's the absolute limit. Most agree you could give only 10%, but you cannot give more than 20%. So the question of how I ever go out to dinner is because Jewish law, which has behind it divine providence, says don't give more than that. Don't give more than that. So the problem doesn't arise in our context. Now, I don't know. I'm not saying that we're in a superior position because it doesn't arise. Just pointing out the difference. But when you put it into our context, these problems don't arise. So I think whenever a question of justice and charity and moral responsibility are raised, one has to take into account the context of divine providence that's behind it. And if you don't do that, then you can arrive at false conclusions. It's a general orienting idea. I'll tell you something else. There's a wonderful Maharsha. You're learning Makos, so you know that the division between onus, shogeg, and mazid, where mazid you're fully responsible for what you do, shogeg because it's a matter of negligence. You have some responsibility, not the whole responsibility, and onus where either you were incapable of doing otherwise, or where your ignorance was permissible. You didn't know and you didn't have to know. There was no requirement for you to know. Under those conditions, you're not punished at all. That's the threefold classification that you have throughout the Torah. But when it comes to murder b'shogeg, or when it comes to murder, there's a fivefold classification. There's mazid, korav l'mazid, shogeg, korav l'onus, and onus. Fivefold. Only a pure shogeg goes into Gullus, goes into internal exile to one of the cities. Right? So, one who's closer to mazid doesn't go, and one who's closer to shogeg doesn't go. One who's closer to mazid is worse. One who's closer to shogeg is less serious. Why would they both be absolved from exile? So Maharsha says, and he applies it to other things as well, there are two different reasons to be absolved from exile. One is that what you've done doesn't require exile to be atoned for. That's serious enough. And the other is it's too serious to be atoned for by exile. Exile isn't bad enough for what you've done. So that's the difference. Korav l'mazid, exile isn't strong enough a penalty to give him expiation from what he's done. And Karav the onus is the opposite. So then there are some cases where he talks about being pater from Malchus. Also, trying to remember exactly which case it is, where a person doesn't get Malchus, doesn't get physical lashes. And in some cases he says that's because physical lashes is too light for the person. It's too easy for the person. He can't get away with just that. So when you find that someone's excused, it doesn't always mean that it's excused from a punishment. It doesn't mean always a leniency. It can be a severity. Okay, you're learning a tough masechta. It's a masechta. Marcus is tough imshat, and learning up so it's going to be very tough. And the ideas are really, really quite extensive, and I would say almost endless. Anything else in your mind while we're talking about that? Otherwise, I'll add one other thing here.
If we have this idea of Hashkata Brachos and this viewpoint that we look at our author, is it then immoral for us to practice secular law?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I don't know if it's immoral, and how it's done. And legislators who are in non-Jewish legislators who are in legislatures. There are rules for them, but I've never gotten a hold of them. I never seen. But I must tell you, in this context, I'm learning Dafyomi as I have been for many years, and just came across a Tosfos. Tosfos is so tough, rationalist, philosophical, logical. They are there are millions of examples. But he says like this: when a person performs an action, he can make it subject to a condition. He can say, "I'm doing this on condition that such and such be the case," and if it doesn't turn out to be the case, then now, the various rules, how to do this, when to do this, under what conditions you are successful in placing a condition on the action. If you don't follow the rules, then the action goes through no matter what you wanted, what you cared about, what you hoped for, what conditions you thought were relevant. Makes no difference. You did the action. The action has its own legal life. Where do we learn the idea that you can put a condition on an action? Where do we learn that from? Maybe it's not possible. If you want something to happen only under certain conditions, maybe you just can't do it. Don't do it. Wait until the conditions turn out and then do it. Do it with full knowledge that it's already true. Who says you can stop an action or make it conditional on some later thing being discovered or some later thing coming to happen? So the Gemara says we learn it from Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain say to Moses, after the Jewish people have conquered certain areas in the eastern side of the Jordan River, we don't want to go to the western side, we want to go to the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. We want to take up possession here. So Moses makes a deal with them. He says, if you will go across the Jordan and fight alongside your brethren until the land of Israel is conquered, then you can take up your possession here. But if you don't go and fight, then you lose it over here, and then you'll have to live on the west side together with everybody else. That's what he says to them. The Gemara says, we learn the concept of putting a condition on an action from that incident. Since it was done there, we learned that it's a general principle that you can do that. Okay. The Gemara says, we learn it from there, then that example has to guide us in when we can make conditions and when we can't make conditions. And one of the points of comparison that has to be fulfilled is this. Think again of what Moses did over there. Moses said to them, if you go across and fight, then you will receive this land on the east. Who will they receive it from? Moses isn't going to be there. Moses is going to die before the conquest takes place. You'll receive it from Joshua. I'm appointing Joshua my agent, and when he splits up the land of Israel, he'll give you what's on the east side. But if you don't go over and fight, then he won't. In this case, where you're putting a condition, You're putting a condition on an action, and it's the kind of action which can be carried out not by the person who's negotiating the agreement, but by his representative. Says the Gemara, that's a pattern for all conditions on all transactions. You can only put a condition on a transaction when the transaction itself can be carried out not by the principal party, but by some agent that he designates. Right? The Gemara applies that to a certain case of the Gemara. Tosfos says, what's the svara? What's the logic behind that? Why should that be relevant? Why should I care whether the later action is subject to being performed by an appointed agent or whether it isn't? Why is that relevant? Now, the very pious reader is inclined to say, what are you talking about, Tosfos? Why do you need to know that there's any logic behind it? The Creator said so. The Creator said, do it this way. So do it that way. Don't ask questions. Just do. But Tosfos doesn't take that. Tosfos doesn't take that. Tosfos says it's got to be a logical explanation. If there isn't a logical explanation, then we won't use the case in the Torah as the pattern. We won't use it. Why not? So Tosfos says, I have a proof. You see, I rely on logic all the way to the end. I have a proof. Because if I'm going to take the case in the Torah as a pattern, as the defining paradigm, then I would only apply it to transactions involving land. This is a question of taking possession of land. What about any other kind of transaction? Buying and selling, non-real property, marriage, divorce, any other kind of action. Do we allow conditions on those actions? We certainly do. The Talmud is full of examples of conditions on those actions. So clearly the Talmud is not doing it blind. It's not doing it blind. Then you have to ask in every case, what is the logic behind it? Now, listen to Tosfos' answer. Ben Yeshua has another answer. And then I'll show you how he follows it out in terms of comparative logic. He says, if I'm going to perform an action and I want to put a condition on it, and it's a kind of action which I don't have to do on my own, I can appoint another person to do on my behalf. Says Tosfos, that means I have complete control over this action. I can dictate how it shall be done. When I have that kind of complete control over the action, then I can also insert a condition as to when it shall be valid, when it shall not be valid. But if the Torah tells me, do it this way and only this way, and you can't do it through a representative, then the Torah is telling me, you don't have that kind of complete control. You don't have bias on the action. You don't have ownership on the action. If you don't have ownership on the action, then you haven't got the authority to make a condition that will determine when the action is effective, when the action isn't effective. Tosfos says this is an absolute piece of absolute logic because nowhere in the Torah, in the Gemara, is it ever discussed that anybody should have a different opinion. Everybody agrees that a condition can only be applied when the action upon which the condition is being attached is one which can be carried out by a representative. But what about Tanai Kofel? Tanai Kofel means that when you make a Tanai, you say, if A happens, if A is true, if A is the case, then B works. How about stating the other half? And if A isn't real, if A doesn't happen, if A isn't correct, then B doesn't work. Must you state it both ways? Or can you do it one way? We say, that when you state it the positive way, we hear by its implication, you state it the other way. That's a machlekes. That's the difference of opinion among Tanoim. Says Tosfos, why is that a difference of opinion? Because there the logic isn't as clear. So there's a dispute as to whether the logic is strong enough to require using that as part of the pattern for conditions under which you make a Tanai. But it's all based on logic. It's all based on svara. Without svara, you can't do anything. That's what Tosfos says. Now, I'm a logician, and I'm a philosopher. For me, Tosfos is gold. Gold! Because I know in philosophy that without presumptions, without assumptions, without presuppositions, you can't do any logic. You can't do any reasoning. All comparisons involve prior judgments, prior evaluations. Thus, the thing is starting from nowhere. So, of course, when you say something, you're pushing it down into a whole context of connections and ideas and definitions and concepts. And all of that is used as part of the interpretive context. So when Tosfos says it, I feel very much at home. And this is Tosfos' attitude. I found it so many times in Shas. The example that I just gave you, Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, the way the psukim read, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven, if you go across and fight, then you will get the land of the east of the Jordan. If you don't go across and fight, then you'll take up your possession on the west. It will be divided the way it was originally intended to be divided. You'll get a piece on the west. Rashi takes it, kipshuto. If you fight, you get the east. If you don't fight, you get the west. Says Tosfos, that's not fair. That's plain and push it, not fair. It's not fair. What do you mean? They're not going to fight? And they're going to get that free? And Tosfos rejects Rashi's explanation on the grounds that it's just not fair. It's not fair. Can't be right.
It's not fair.
Well, let's see if I can explain this. What happened up until now? Up until now, they've conquered Og and Sichon on the east side. Who engaged in that battle? Everybody. The whole people engaged in that battle to destroy Og and Sichon. Right? Now, there's going to be a battle for the west side. So why should it be that 9.5 tribes will fight the battle for the west side, 2.5 will not fight, and the 2.5 who don't fight will get a portion of the west side? Why should they get something they didn't fight for? This is just not fair. You're not paying the dues. Why should you get the spoils? So Tosfos has a different explanation. I don't remember what the different explanation is, but at any rate, that's another case where Tosfos simply says it's not logical. And since it's not logical, it's to be mayor in the Chachamim. Okay.